This is a hat trick
podcast.
Oh, lovely.
Right, everyone, I just want to give you a heads up that the text we're talking about in this episode, well, it contains adult themes and, some explicit language. So, please listen to the episode before sharing with younger students or children to make sure that you're completely comfortable for them to listen. All right, buckle up, on with the show. Hi, Armand.
Hi, Jimmy.
So this week we're going to discuss an excerpt, a line from a poem, which is from a much larger body of work, and they were called...
The Satires.
By
Juvenal.
By Juvenal, right.
Satire in Latin.
Okay, so Juvenal was a satirist. What does satire mean? Where does it come from?
So one of the things about satire, which of course is funny...
Yes, well...
But it's also very biting. It's a genre which we're told is essentially an entirely Roman one. So Quintilian, the grammarian and rhetorician, writes, Satura tota nostra est, satire is entirely our thing. That is Roman thing. Because, of course, the Latin poets and authors took all their literary models from the Greeks, but not satire. I mean, there were, of course, satirical things going on in ancient Greece, which the Romans would have read.
I guess Aristophanes.
Yes, the comedian Aristophanes above all,
right,
being very satirical, poking fun at politicians and contemporary life. But no specific genre called satire. If one thinks about satire and being satirical, and you ask, what does it go back to? Juvenal is probably the key figure in the ancient world. Born roughly 50 AD, probably wrote his satires in the early 2nd century.
Right.
It strikes one that, given the dating we know, that he would have been quite an oldish guy when he was doing it. And he produced these brilliant satires, 5 books of satires, that is 16 actual pieces of satire, of which the longest is book 3, which is just one long 700-line poem in which he has a go at the idea of getting married. And he's absolutely horrible about women. So he's...
Do we know if he was married?
We don't. We assume not from that satire.
Well, you never know. Maybe very unhappily married and therefore...
Quite possible, indeed.
An expert.
Yeah. But it's actually...
So we know nothing about him in terms of...
We know surprisingly little about him biographically. He's very chauvinistic about being Roman, which we assume that he was, of relatively high-born Roman
because
birth.
he's not patronised. There's no patron in his life, is there? There's no one giving him money to write.
No, that's right. So he's writing because he's choosing to write.
Right.
And I mean, to be so well-educated, to become a lawyer as he was, and then to go on to write this brilliant hexameter verse with such confidence and such knowledge of everything from modern politics through to, ancient mythology. Yeah, he was an elite. But he has a go at everything. And he's attacking it for all kinds of reasons that make him a very bitter satirist. So he's not just a misogynist, as Satire 6 indicates, but also homophobic. He's xenophobic. He hates all the foreigners. He hates rich people because of the way they look down on the poor. And we'll unpack a line later on in the episode that occurs in the satire we're talking about today, which is Satire 10. It's the first satire of book 4 of Juvenal Satires. And it's about the stupid things that human beings pray for. And he goes through them and he talks about them and he pokes fun at the idea that, this is something you want. I mean, it can be quite savage, really.
It's quite full of... compared to the other ones where he does put the boot into life in Rome in Satire 3, which is very racist against the Greeks, for example.
Yeah.
When that awful incident happened, Grenfell, and there was a issue around the cladding, he talks about in Satire 3 that if you're stuck up in a high-rise, you're in danger because the state of the buildings are so poor, and that the fire brigade never get there in time.
Yes.
And it does feel like a very modern kind of litany of complaints that we have about living in a modern city. Satire 3, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Whereas this one is kind of more philosophical, isn't it? But it's like, what do you wish for? People pray for the wrong things. And he starts off by saying most people pray for cash.
Yes.
He says most people go on their knees in the temples and says, give me more money.
Yeah.
It reminds me of this joke of a guy who goes into church and he says, God, my name's Sam and my business is failing and I just need to win the lottery this week. And he goes back the following and says, God, I didn't win the lottery this week. I'm just saying, if you're up there, I'm a good guy. I do my best. I come to church every week. I just need to win the lottery. He doesn't win the lottery. He goes back the third week. He says, God, you're really clearly not listening to me. I'm questioning my faith. I really need to win the lottery to save my business. And a voice in the sky says, Sam, buy a bloody ticket. So it's that thing of, having to meet life halfway. Anyway, it was a
yes.
joke.
Well, I mean, so this Juvenal is saying we're all praying for money. As he says, let my wealth grow, let my treasure chest be the biggest in the whole forum.
Yeah.
He says, but you won't drink poison from earthenware. You only need fear when you are handed a goblet studded with jewels, or when the best wine glows in your golden bowl. So the idea is that if you're very wealthy, you will probably be poisoned. In fact, one of the things that he tells us about in Satire 6 is how, if your wife reckons that you're going to leave loads of money, you better be careful because she'll slip some poison into your bowl. And that's the kind of thing, don't pray for money. There are going to be people who want to kill you for it.
Yes.
He says a traveller who's empty-handed can sing in the mugger's face.
Mm. So you can't have wealth. But what about power? Because that's the other thing that he goes on to mention, is that people crave earthly power. Yeah. And he tells a terrible story of Sejanus.
Yeah. And he says, down their statues come, dragged by a rope. I always think of Saddam
Hussein, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And he says the flames are hissing now that head, idolised by the people, is glowing from the bellows and furnace. Huge Sejanus is crackling. This was
so. Who was he?
Tiberius' powerful advisor, who rose to the very top until he gets dragged through the roads by a hook, as Juvenal puts it, and everybody then celebrates. So, having been the most powerful man, suddenly everyone's saying he was a complete...
Because that's when he talks about the Roman mob, doesn't he? He hasn't got much time for the Roman mob, Juvenal. I mean, he said, I never liked Sejanus anyway, which is actually a bit, again, it's like a modern mindset, is that we can go off people pretty quickly in modern times.
Yeah, absolutely. And so he says, what about this Roman mob? And this is where another very important phrase comes.
Yes,
he says,
one of my favourites.
He says, it's way back that they discarded their responsibilities since the time we stopped selling our votes. So that's when Tiberius transferred the elections of magistrates from the people to the Senate.
Right.
So the people no longer felt that they had any power to elect their officials. And so he said, from that time, we've discarded our responsibilities. Proof, people that once used to bestow military commands, high office, legions, everything, now limits itself. It has an obsessive desire for two things only: bread and circuses.
Yes, panem et circenses.
Panem et circenses.
But that is also how governments manage people. Mm. And the truth is that most governments want their people to be kind of comatose and anaesthetised and placated. I had this image of kind of, especially during lockdown, that, instead of bread and circuses, it was probably marijuana and Netflix.
Netflix and chill.
Yeah. So it is very well observed that that's the mob's thing. Is if you give me enough to eat, and I've got enough distraction, I'm cool. I don't want to get involved.
And in this particular case, the panem, the bread, is a dole. It was doled out to Roman citizens. It was hugely important, So the corn dole and the circuses, of course, are the public entertainment.
Yeah.
And that's what people want. They want to fill their bellies and to have some fun.
I mean, a Roman politician would know that putting on a good games would make you incredibly popular.
Yeah. So games with gladiators, as we all know, possibly being killed at the end of these fights with animals. I
mean, interesting, the London Games did Boris Johnson an enormous amount of good because he was identified with the games, wasn't he?
Very much so, yes.
Someone wrote a poem, a Pythian ode to celebrate this on behalf of Boris Johnson. Didn't they?
He did commission me to write an ode for the Olympic Games. It's true, and
I'm sorry to throw you under that bus.
No, sorry, but he delivered it brilliantly. Actually.
He did.
I have to say, I presented it to him. It was in ancient Greek and in English translation, and it went something like, This new Olympic flame behold, which once burned bright in Greece of old. With happy hearts receive once more the games performed on London's shore, and so on. So,
I heard him do that at a Classics for All do that you were there at as well, the thing I'm chairman of. And you both did it with great gusto. He spoke ancient Greek fluently. If only he'd continued to speak ancient Greek throughout his entire career, it would have been fine. There's a bit in the section on power and what a folly it is to pray for power, where he says, few kings go down to Ceres' son-in-law.
That is Pluto, the king of the underworld.
Yes, without blood and carnage. Few tyrants escape a bloodless death, a sicca morte, which means a dry death, doesn't it?
So in other words, bloodless.
You're not kind of wet with... Yeah. That's so kind of graphic. But I like the idea he calls Hades... He calls Pluto Ceres' son-in-law.
Yes. So, of course, Ceres is the goddess whose daughter, Persephone or Proserpina, became the wife of Pluto, or Hades, the god of the underworld.
Yeah, and they do a deal, don't they?
Yes. So she can be in the underworld part of the time and the upper world part of the time. That's when spring comes back.
So it's like an explanation of the seasons.
Explanation of the seasons. But... just to pick that up, this is the kind of learnedness with which juvenile satires are full of.
Yeah.
Mythological, historical, all sorts of things. And it's partly because he's writing in verse. So he's writing in hexameter verse, and that's very important because hexameters, that is dactylic hexameters, a particular rhythm, is the verse form for the epic. So the epic of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are written in this verse form. And these are the most important bits of art literature in the ancient world. And so why would you pick up this incredibly important, resonant verse form to write satire?
I don't know why, Armand.
Well, for a lot of reasons. But, if you're a satirist, what you're saying is, this is terribly important, but I'm going to turn it around and tell you that actually what's important is the folly and stupidity of human beings of my time. And some people have called satire epics ugly twin, or epic's evil twin.
It's the other side of the coin, isn't it? Why I loved Juvenal as a kid is I wanted to be in comedy, and I thought, God, that view of the modern world that Juvenal had is exactly the same view that comedians have. And, every week we do Have I Got News For You, where we look at the modern world and we mock it viciously. But that view that Juvenal had of his contemporary life and his contemporary figures is mirrored by modern comedians and how they look at the world. They look at the world in exactly the same way as Juvenal. They may not express themselves in such brutal terms, but nevertheless, it's a very similar view, I think.
So you use a serious generic form like the hexameter in order to say something that is the opposite in some ways.
But also, if you're using a form which the audience would have been used to hearing great, epic, very important poetry, using it for comic purposes actually underlines the pomposity of it as well, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And actually, Juvenal sets this out in his very first satire. What am I doing? He says. The very first words are, am I always going to be a member of the audience? He says, why can't I actually say what I need to say? And he then tells us what it means being a member of the audience. He says, all these people out there are producing tragedies and epic tales, which are just a load of bombast and nonsense, he says. I don't want to keep listening to these people trying to be terribly serious and pompous about it. He says it's an act of mercy when you run into so many bards everywhere to spare paper that's bound to be wasted anyway. I might as well write stuff.
Right.
Because they're writing all this rubbish. And then he says, what am I going to write about? Well, the subject matter presents itself, the stupidity and folly of the modern world. He says it's impossible not to write satire when we're living in this world where everything has turned upside down, where the rich are people from abroad who are now, he says, lording it over traditional Roman families. For example, that's part of his xenophobia, where you can get everywhere by bribing, that's the only way you can live, that you're dependent on flattering the highborn. So he goes into all the problems that you have in modern-day Rome as a Roman citizen. And he says you can only write satire about this stuff.
In many ways, he's trying to instruct people and guide people into living a good life, isn't he, here? Because he's like, the next section he talks about fame.
Right. Back to SI 10, yeah.
And he talks about Demosthenes and Cicero, both of them very famous for the things they said and they wrote. They were very eloquent. And you would think, well, why wouldn't I want to be eloquent and express myself in a beautiful way, using all the tropes of great rhetoric? And he says, well, that's all right. You can do all that. He said, but then look what happened to them. Because they both came to sticky ends. Demosthenes was the great orator in ancient Greece, wasn't he?
Yes, and he railed against the Macedonians who were about to conquer Athens, his city.
And so he harangued the Athenian population on a regular basis, did he?
That's right. And so when the Macedonians did eventually conquer Athens, they found Demosthenes and they arrested him. And famously, Demosthenes had concealed some poison in his pen, and he said, I'm just going to write my will, and he stuck his pen in his mouth and he killed himself, thereby proving that the pen is mightier than the sword.
Boom. I'm glad we got that out. And then Cicero, I remember seeing the RSC adaptation of the Robert Harris book,
yes,
which I thought was brilliant, because it portrayed Cicero as being quite a piece of work, really. A man who was sexually attracted to his own words, I felt. Didn't he write something about his own
greatness?
Consulship.
Yes, Cicero was a wonderful wordsmith when it came to prose. So we have his wonderful orations.
I know, we've all suffered those translations as well.
Well, he is marvellously eloquent. But when it came to writing poetry, he had a tin ear.
Right.
And he begged various poets to write poems glorifying his consulship. So famously, he put down the so-called Catilinarian conspiracy. He had the various supposed conspirators executed when he was consul. And he claimed to have saved Rome from Catiline, the conspirator. He wanted this to be written in hexameter epic, because that was the way in which people were glorified. Great generals had been glorified before, and doesn't seem to have had much success. So he decided to write one himself, and a few lines
in praise of myself.
Yeah, in praise of myself. And
nice idea.
Now, if you think of a hexameter verse, it should roll like in one of Virgil's wonderful verses. Arma virumque cano troiaequi primus ab armis da 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 da. But what does Cicero write? O fortuna tam me consule Romam.
Right.
Oh, lucky Rome, born in my consulship.
Yeah.
It's a terrible line.
And did they kill him just for writing that line?
Well, they killed him for his eloquence. So, of course, they killed him for having basically spoken against the wrong people. Mark Antony in particular.
Well, Mark Antony, he spoke out because he was basically saying Mark Antony is going to bring down the Republic.
What happened was then he was then executed, riding in his litter, and Antony sent his slaves and they chopped poor old Cicero's head off.
Didn't he put his head out saying, I'll make it easier for you?
He did.
Yeah.
Yeah. He says, he leant out of his litter and said, go on then.
A very kind of decent way to go.
Yeah. And apparently Antony's wife hated Cicero so much that she used her hairpins to stab his tongue after he died. So pretty gruesome stuff.
That's nice. So the argument here that Juvenal is building is these are really famous men of their time.
Yeah.
And they flew too near to the sun, and in the end it was their comeuppance. And I think that is also a very modern idea about fame, isn't it? That fame is...
I think in this particular case, actually, he's not so much talking about fame as intellectual ability.
Right.
So he says the eloquence and reputation of Demosthenes or Cicero is what boys keep on praying for. But he says, but it was because of their eloquence that both orators died. It was the abundant, overflowing gush of talent that sent both to their deaths. It was talent that had its hands and neck severed. He goes on to say, the rostrum was never drenched in the blood of a feeble advocate. So if you're no good, you're not going to be killed.
So, all right, so then he goes on to talk about what's the value of wishing for a long life.
Yes,
people say, be well, have a long life, live for a long time. And he thinks, probably not a great idea to be like Nestor, for example.
No, old men all look the same, he says, voice and body trembling alike, head now quite smooth, a baby's dripping nose, the pathetic creature has to munch his bread with weaponless gums. So
Yeah.
don't pray for old age. You'll just get old and doddering, and, the delights of food and wine are no longer the same as his palate grows numb. And as for sex, it's now just a distant memory. Or if you try to rouse him, his stringy little prick lies limp with its enlarged vein and will stay limp, though you coax it all night long. I don't know if I'm allowed to say all that. But
You can say what you like.
That's what Juvenal writes.
Yeah, no.
It's fantastic. I have to say, it's fantastic in the Latin.
Yeah.
It's terribly good. I mean, this is
brutal.
Epic meter used to say this kind of thing.
Filth.
Yeah, indeed.
Oh, the other thing to say about old age, of course, is that you tend to outlive your children and your friends. There's a story in the New York Times from the divorce courts where a divorce court judge was granting a couple a decree absolute on the grounds of irretrievable breakdown, and they were both 93 and 91 respectively. And the judge said, of course I'll award you your divorce, but I'm fascinated. Why have you waited this long? And he said, well, we thought we'd wait until both the kids had died. So the final thing is, he talks about beauty and being very attractive. Surely, most mothers say, please make my baby attractive. But he says, no, think again. Too much of that is bad for you.
Yeah, he says, go on then, take pride in your lad's good looks. There are greater dangers that await him. He'll become a notorious Casanova, fearing whatever punishment furious husbands exact.
Right.
Death by the sword, savage slicing with lashes, even buggery with a mullet. That's the fate of adulterers. So that's the kind of thing that was done if you were found adulterous. Yes, radishes and mullets.
You're beaten with a fish?
Not so much beaten.
Oh,
as penetrated.
They shoved the mullet where the sun don't shine. That must be quite difficult.
That was the famous Roman punishment for adultery.
Really? Come on, you can't just skip by that. How would they? Was that a kind of judgment? Would they, or was it kind of just
I think it's a kind of ad hoc notion.
So the husband with his mates would go around,
exactly,
get the bloke out.
Yeah, and presumably they've gone to the market first and bought their mullets.
If you saw a bunch of blokes walking up the street towards your house carrying a mullet, you'd have reason to flinch.
You can imagine fishmonger. I'll have a pound of mullets and some radishes over there. Right, has someone been doing something with your wife, sir?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly that.
That's fantastic.
So he ends with saying, but is there then nothing that people should pray for? And
he says
he comes up with this at the very end, and he says, well, the one thing you should pray for is a sound mind and a sound body. Mens sana in corpore sano. So that's probably a very well-known Latin phrase of all the Latin phrases used. If you say mens sana in corpore sano, healthy mind and a healthy body.
Yeah.
People generally know what that means, but
people say that sometimes to sound clever as well, don't they? People in golf clubs, they'll go, mens sana in corpore sano. But actually, in the end, if you don't have a sound mind and you're physically ill, everything else pales into insignificance. So I suppose he's quite wise.
Yeah, and he says, I'm showing you something you can give yourself. There's no doubt that the only path to a peaceful life lies through goodness. And the word in Latin is virtus, goodness. Virtue, we might say. But that's how he defines virtue. Healthy mind, healthy body. That's all we can pray for, if we have any sense.
But of course, the mens sana in corpore sano industry these days actually is sometimes out of whack, isn't it?
Very much so.
The preoccupation with mental health, the preoccupation with bodily health has spawned billion-dollar industries. So even mens sana in corpore sano can be twisted and distorted.
I think now that would be a very good fruit for satire.
Yeah.
The way people are trying to improve, we're all trying to improve our mental health, trying to improve our physical health in a way that has gone to extremes.
Okay, well, maybe there's a young Juvenal out there that's going to have a go at that. I'll see you next week.
See you then.
It's All Greek and Latin to Me is presented by Armand and Jimmy Mulville. The producer is Diggory Waite and the executive producer is Claire Broughton. It's All Greek and Latin to Me is a hat-trick podcast.
Hi everyone, I just wanted to give a mention to Classics for All. Classics for All is a charity, and what we want to do is provide access to the classics to as many state school pupils as possible. Alongside training teachers who don't actually have to have any previous training in the subject, they hope that they make classics a sustainable part of the school curriculum. If you want to find out more about this fantastic charity, go to the website. It's www.classicsforall.org.uk.